I really couldn't stand their meetings. Everyone was required to attend, and these meetings it would go on for hours. It was just really long and terrible and boring. I don't want to generalize, but I'm going to generalize. In Japan, people don't like to be openly confrontational. We all know that different opinions, allowing people to feel free to express those differences, it ultimately leads to a better decision. But people have to feel safe enough to do that.
Today I spoke with Nami Ishihara, a group facilitator and team building expert. She works with the Belbin team roles, and on this podcast we really unpacked the Belbin process from a facilitator perspective.
I'll make it as a coach, light the spark inside, empower every soul to turn the tide. I'll make it as a coach, help others grow, changing lives with every story I know.
As usual, we started our conversation with a deep pictures warm-up, and we worked with the MetaFox positive psychology cards. Nami chose an image of an unsteady river flowing over mossy rocks. For her, this was a metaphor of her unsteady path, living abroad and working different roles in management consulting and in academia, finally coming to terms with the fact that she failed, or at least stopped her PhD, and then taking ownership of her own story and going her path towards group facilitation as a profession.
Well, when I saw this image, I pictured a river flowing, but it's not straight. It's like there are lots of bends, and then there are lots of rocks, and there are some side currents flowing off to the side. So I can imagine if I'm floating down this river, maybe I'm trying to get somewhere, but the water's like carrying me somewhere different. Those are the features that stood out for me. Because, fundamentally being a facilitator, it's not something that I chose from the beginning, and it's something I kind of fell into. It wasn't a path that I set for myself and said, okay, I'm going to be this. And then moved around a lot. So every time I've had to kind of adapt my practice to where I was moving. And so I think that the river part, being able to adapt and also being thrown into different situations.
So you are Japanese, you grew up in Japan, but then you had just told me actually you lived in the US and Laos, and that's also where your two children were born. And right now you're based in Indonesia, right?
Yep. A long story short, so I was born in Japan. My parents are both Japanese. My father worked for a Japanese company that had offices in the US. And we lived in the US for 8 years when I was growing up as a child. I've always felt part of me Japanese, part of me American. And I went to school in both countries, kind of moving back and forth. And as I pursued my studies, I became interested in the Middle East. So I majored in political science. I studied politics of the Middle East. I actually lived in Israel for a year after graduating. And I've always considered myself an outsider-insider type person, because I have never really fully belonged in any one culture. And I've often been a kind of cultural bridge between my parents or my friends. After a lot of different life events, I started to work with groups and facilitating their workshops, retreats, helping groups make decisions together and also plan effectively. When I started doing that work, I think my upbringing of living in different places really influenced my outlook as a facilitator. And I think it's one of the things that I really, kind of a thread throughout my life, is being a bridge.
Let's stay in your childhood experience. You said you went to school in Japan and in the US.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If you look at these two systems and ways of education, how did you perceive that?
Well, as a child, you experience it kind of thrown into it. You don't have other frames of reference, So I did the best I could. There were because I lived in the US from age 6 to about 13. So you can say that my base was already kind of Americanized, at least in terms of my schooling. But at home, we were a very Japanese family. When our family moved back to Japan, I had this strange sensation that I could understand what people were saying, but I couldn't really understand what was going on. Wanting to fit in, but not really wanting to fit in. I remember that being a big kind of a struggle in junior high and high school.
Yeah, listening to you, I was reminded of watching Shogun, the Netflix series about this, I think, British guy arriving in Japan in the 16th century or something. And there's many small instances of individualist culture, which I guess you have a lot in the US and also Europe. And then the Japanese understanding of being part of a society, being part of a strong sense of honor and duty.
Yeah, I mean, there are elements of that. I think that kind of the honor and duty part, it's over glamorized or something. In the public school in Japan, one of the first things that I noticed was that we were expected to do things in groups. So it was called han. Han, it's just groups of maybe 4 or 5 kids. And I think that's certainly one element. Although it always seemed a little too simplistic to divide cultures in terms of individualist or group. Back in those days, 20, 30 years ago, people really thought in terms of binary, like you're either American or Japanese, or you're either Western, Eastern, Oriental. I take issue with that because I found a lot of elements in American society where it's actually very conformist. Japanese society does tend to be more group-oriented, but at the same time, there is room for individual expression.
Yeah, I can see lots of foreshadowing of you then working with groups on the one hand, but then also working with Belbin team roles instead of, let's say, MBTI personality types. Yeah.
Basically, I worked for a while as a management consultant, doing international work. And then I thought that I really wanted to go deeper into research. I've always loved to figure things out and to do teaching. So I did a master's in political science and then went on to do PhD. But in the middle of my PhD, I had some major life changes. My husband found a good career move for him. We decided to move to Vientiane, Laos. I thought, oh, maybe if I move to another country, it might help me overcome this block, yeah? And in hindsight, maybe I was trying to escape my troubles, you know. So we moved to Laos as a family, but then I found myself in a very far away country, no work because I had to stop teaching, 2 really young children in a totally different country and no idea what to do. So this was my first crisis. It was like I had a life crisis.
And if you look back at that, how did that mold you in the group facilitator you eventually became today?
It was maybe the hardest decision in my life, to quit.
To quit the PhD?
Yeah, and I think if someone asked me, what was your first step to start to become a facilitator? I would probably say the first step was to quit my PhD. For practical reasons, I needed to finish that chapter and say, okay, I'm not going to pursue this path anymore. Until then, I was constantly thinking, oh, maybe I can go back to it. Maybe I'll try to find a job in a related field. And I was doing short-term consultancies, like 2 or 3 months, but they were not exactly what I wanted to be doing. And so when I decided to completely quit, it was difficult because I had to admit to myself that, you know, it was not the right path for me. And yes, I made some bad choices. I had some responsibility. And I felt bad because I felt guilty because there were many people who sponsored me and I felt like I was letting people down. So that was really hard. But I said, okay, I'm going to close that door. Then other doors started to open.
Yeah, you just mentioned the word defeat, and sounds tough, and at the same time, it sounds very empowered. You take ownership and say, okay, this is not it. I will now do that instead. It also seems like a powerful switch towards self-employment, I guess, like this taking now charge of my own path. Did you experience it like that? Or does it now look like that when you look back at it, but it looked very different in the moment?
Yeah, that sounds nice, the way you framed it. But the way I was experiencing it dragged on for 2 years. So it took me 2 years to really make that decision. I think it shouldn't, I don't know, I wish it didn't take so long. But you know what, it's a kind of regret.
What advice would you give yourself back then, and maybe other people who are in a similar spot right now?
Actually, quitting something, it's actually courageous. It takes a lot of courage. Because it means, for me, it meant to give, I didn't think that I was a failure, but I was telling myself that, okay, you're a failure. You failed at something. And I didn't want to think of myself as a failure. But, you know, the reality is, yeah, I stopped PhD, so I failed in that. But at the same time, I think it was brave. It was brave of me to say that. And I kept getting questions from people. Why did you quit? You know, are you going to go back? And I say, no.
And how would you say, what role does culture play here? Because I imagine also being exposed to the American spirit of being proud of failure in a way, like thinking of this startup culture. It's like, yeah, basically you could look at it like your first venture failed. Now you learned this and that, and now you move on to your next one. It doesn't sound like you saw it that way, despite having grown up in the US to some extent.
No, I didn't, because I already invested a lot of time and money into it. You know, oh yeah, but then I'm sure the startups would do that too. Yeah, and I guess that in terms of culture, I think there is a self-imposed, but also from society, from my parents, or, you know, for example, they're like, what went wrong? Why are you doing this? And then, of course, I didn't have any other prospects, which was worse. You know? It's like unemployed. And then also the identity issue of you're just a stay-at-home mom, you're a trailing spouse, you know, you're just following your husband, all that kind of labeling that I put on myself, and that I think, and also people put on me, that I was very aware of.
And how did you work yourself out of that?
I didn't like it. You know, of course, no one likes to be labeled like in those ways. But at the same time, some of it was true. Yeah, I am a mom. And there are elements that, you know, and I am also interested in a lot of things. Maybe this could transition into the volunteer work that I studied, that I started when I lived in Laos. So I met a group of other women who were part of this volunteer group. It was called the Women's International Group. It was a group of mostly expat or foreign women. Many were spouses of men working in different organizations. When I first met them, to be honest, I thought like people looked at them as just housewives. The reality was very different. I met women, mostly older than me by decades, you know, 10, 20 years older, who had taken care of many children. They had managed multiple moves across continents, and they had lived in a lot of tough situations in different countries in Africa or Middle East, or not safe countries. And they were very brave, and they did what they could. I really respected them and their life.
You focus a lot now on the wife aspect, but you had seen the world that other people can only dream of. You had worked as a management consultant.
Yeah.
You had maybe not finished the PhD, but had gotten that exposure to academia at the super reputable university. And yet, you don't seem to see that very much yourself.
I think at the time, I really went back to asking myself, who am I? And what can I do? What's my value? And yes, just from my experience, my upbringing, my education, maybe I have a wider perspective than most. Academia, it's a quite narrow, very specialized field where everyone else is like each other. People tend to be similar. Go into academia, you're competing over the same grants and you're writing papers and you're critiquing each other, and it's a pretty narrow scope of people, and a specific kind of intelligence is valued. It's very verbal, it's very cerebral, it's kind of critique based. So it was that kind of world that I was in. And then going from that to meeting a very wide range of just very different kinds of people than I was used to, it really made me realize that, the world is actually wider than what I know.
And what resource did you take from that for your group facilitator role in future?
I think because I had to change careers, and as I said, I quit my PhD, I feel like I can connect with a wide range of people. I can talk with, and I'm interested in where they're from or what they're doing. What do they find challenging? Who are they? What do they care about? And being a mother helps. I mean, it's not all. I'm not saying that you have to be a mom to connect with other moms, but it helps to have kids and to experience that. So since then, when I moved to different places, I don't feel that intimidated talking to people who come from very different backgrounds. I just talk with them as people, and I assume that they're interesting. I assume that their lives are very interesting. If you think that you know it all, and I have to admit, I do have this tendency, I think I know it. I know what you're going to say, but we have to have that curiosity. It's so important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's such a powerful connection skill.
Yeah.
I would like to cycle back to our first conversation that we had when I said it would be great to get you on the Making of a Coach podcast. And you were very focused on that point. I'm not a coach, I'm a group facilitator. Why do you find this difference important?
Oh, okay. So the first group in the practice that I follow, being a professional, IAF is the International Association of Facilitators. It's a global professional association and accreditation body. The actual term is group process facilitation. So it's the work of helping groups achieve their goal. It can be to make a decision or plan, or maybe to improve the way they're working together. Whatever they want to achieve, a facilitator is someone who helps to guide the process. There's a focus on the group dynamics and the group conversations. I regard my job is to help those conversations go more deeper, more meaningful, more smoothly, making sure that they arrive at where they want to go. And coach, I'm not a coach, but I know many colleagues who have also trained as a coach. Coaching is more individual. I know there are also coaches who also work with groups, so more group coaching. And there is a certain degree of overlap. But that said, there's certainly a different set of skills, and maybe also the competencies are pretty different.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. How did you then get from this volunteering work to on this path to becoming a facilitator?
Yeah, so for me, it was two paths that converged. The first path was I started volunteering with this organization. This was a group that did fundraising, and then they used the money to spend on small projects to benefit the local community. I became the project manager, or I was helping organize volunteers, helping raise money.
You also had a leadership role there, right? You were leading a group or a team of 170 people from 30 countries?
Yeah, I was. Then the reason why I started doing that is because I really couldn't stand their meetings. I first started as a regular volunteer, and then I became the manager of the health project side. And everyone who was a manager was required to attend executive committee meetings once a month. And these meetings would go on for hours, And it was just really long and terrible and boring. There was a lot of fighting, but under the table fighting, political trafficking, like all these things. And this was a volunteer group, but this was pretty serious conflicts going on in there. I just couldn't stand it. And I thought, okay, I love what we're doing, but I hate the meetings. And at a certain point, I thought, I want to become the president so I can change the meetings.
Which again, some foreshadowing to a future group process facilitation role, right?
Yeah.
Scratching
I thought
your
these
own
meetings,
itch.
it was so bad. Do you know the Roberts Rules? It's this book that was popular in the US, I guess in the 1950s or something. It's a rule book that many nonprofits use as a procedure book for meetings. So there are certain rules, like you have to say a certain thing to raise a motion. But the point is that people have to follow these steps. And if you don't follow it, it's not valid. There's a lot of emphasis on this procedural aspect and not so much on the conversation or the real discussion. So the real discussion was not happening. Maybe that's what's happening in our politics today. There was a lot of posturing and a lot of positioning, but not a lot of, let's explore this together, or what could be a different way of looking at it, or are we really considering other points of view? Let's hear from other people who are not part of this. Let's cast a wider net. And not just taking a vote. How about we consider the issues a little bit more before we take things to a vote? So there were a lot of things about the decision making that really bothered me that I wanted to change.
Yeah, maybe at this point, let's break the chronological order of your journey a bit and go right into this consensus finding process. Because I read this article of yours where you described the fine art of fostering dissent in a group as a facilitator and doing that in a sort of authentic way. Can you take us into this problem space? Maybe on the one hand, from your participant perspective, back then as a volunteer leader, and also today from a facilitation perspective.
Oh, yeah. For me, it's a really interesting topic. I'll tell a short story. So this happened with this particular volunteer group. And I remember walking into this meeting. There were about 20 people seated in somebody's living room. And the regular members were talking, and they were coming to a decision about something really important. And then this lady walks in, like she's from another different project. And she's like, I don't know why you guys are all spending this money on this one person, one child. Wouldn't the money be better spent if more evenly distributed so that we can help a larger number of people rather than just putting it all for one person? You know, and why are we arbitrarily choosing this? And then the room just went up there. Everybody just it created this whole uproar. And I remember thinking, as an outsider, who had just come in as a new member, she has a point actually. But they shot her down. She didn't even have any time to go further. But I thought, that's an example, especially if you have several members in there who are, maybe they have power or who are especially passionate or they're invested in an issue. And people tend to follow the opinions of those people who are stronger or more powerful, or they have the louder voices. And I saw it in action, that the drive towards consensus, when other options aren't considered, when there's no space for that discussion, it doesn't always lead to the best decision. And I remember seeing that and experiencing that. And then later on, when I learned about different techniques for helping groups to make decisions together, usually the emphasis is on the building consensus part. It is an important part. But I'm always reminded of that incident and thinking, the value of having that dissent of that person or people in the room who don't agree or who has a different viewpoint, even if the viewpoint is wrong, even if the viewpoint is kind of old way of thinking, there's value in it, because if that person can have the space to speak freely, then it gives the courage for another person to say, actually, I have another idea. It opens up the space.
Yeah. It reminds me of a book that we read in the Metafox leadership team this year, which is The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And basically I took one point from this book, and this is: successful teams know how to argue well and do argue.
Yeah.
And how do you make that happen as a facilitator?
Oh, that's hard, especially if you come or if you're in a conflict avoidant kind of culture. Usually people are really scared of conflict. I don't want to generalize, but I'm going to generalize. In Asia, or I know like in Japan, certainly, people don't like to be openly confrontational. But we all know that conflict or disagreements, different opinions, allowing people to feel free to express those differences, it ultimately leads to a stronger team and a better decision. So it's better. But people have to feel safe enough to do that. One of the ways is to, for example, then there are some practical things you can do, like one, give people time and space to write on paper first before calling people, asking them to express something, or asking people to write anonymously, maybe using an app like Slido or Mentimeter, like using it online so that nobody knows. Or if you're in a group that has a kind of hierarchical, there are managers and non-managers and people doing different roles, I might divide people up so people with the same levels would be together. So rather than have the boss and then the subordinates in one group, I might separate the management from the group and then have them discuss amongst themselves, if that hierarchy is a factor.
And the boss being in one breakout together with other team members would basically sabotage the group, actually, even without intending to.
Yeah.
By voicing his attention.
Yeah. Most understanding, most open-minded person, even then, just the presence of that person could impede expression.
Yeah, so number one was ask people to write down first and only then go into discussion. And that, I imagine, helps because people have written this down and then they are more likely to express their original idea, even if somebody else expressed something sort of opposing. I still have it on my notes, should still bring it up
like
now.
having it written down, it's quite powerful. Another technique is, maybe you've heard of 1, 2, 4 all. It's this gradual progression of sharing or expressing your thoughts first as an individual. So you have a few minutes to reflect and think by yourself before you hear what other people are thinking. So you first have a chance to formulate your ideas on your own. And then maybe you share it with another person, so in pairs. So it feels a little bit safer than having to share it in a group. And then once you get the confidence, like, oh, okay, I'm not the only person who thinks this, then you have the chance to a little bit modify, or maybe you get a different idea from the other person. And then you can move on to share that idea with a larger group of people, let's say 4 people or 6. So that's another technique that a lot of facilitators use.
Did you know that when you were leading these large groups and then the large meetings in the volunteer work? How did that come?
So around the same time that I became very active in the volunteer group, I started getting requests to facilitate staff retreats for international development agencies that are based in in Laos. And this was by chance because a friend of mine happened to recommend me to be a facilitator because I used to teach. So for her, she thought that that was qualification enough. Yeah, I was so clueless, yeah. And probably the person hiring me wasn't particularly picky about facilitation. And in the beginning, I didn't know that there was even such a thing as facilitation. I didn't even know. So like, what is a facilitator? What does a facilitator do? I didn't even know. For the first retreat, they wanted to play some team building games, right? So I just searched like team building games on the internet. I put on my teacher hat, I guess. And then gradually I started doing a little bit research, like what is facilitation? What are the tools? What are some techniques? I was very lucky because I had this volunteer group that I could experiment on. Yeah, so I just tried out a lot of these techniques that I was reading about with this group. I also gathered a group of friends who were also interested in facilitation, and we started a study group. Because in Laos at the time, there was obviously no school or no training course that we could take. I bought a few books, made photocopies, and we went through chapter by chapter. And that also helped. And then about 2 years after that, I attended my first conference, the IAF, International Association of Facilitators, Asia conference in Singapore. That was in 2014. And that was like the defining moment for me to be in a room full of facilitators. Really amazing experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because until that point, you've been sort of an autodidact, coming from this very long meetings, then having teams where this productive dissent didn't work. And coming from this frustration, you said, okay, let me learn this and let me also try this, because you were in this volunteering that you perceived as a safe environment to also experiment and learn by doing in a way. Mm-hmm. And I guess then getting in touch with IFF, this world opened of, wow, there's so many people who actually do this for a living.
Yeah.
How was that?
It was really eye-opening. And I felt, because until that point, I was not really knowing if what I was doing or the things I was struggling with, if other people also experienced it. And I also didn't know where to start, other than just buying books and reading them. How could I learn more? And then when I went to this conference and I met other facilitators from Singapore, from Australia, from all different parts of the world, and they each had different paths. You know, some people worked within a bigger organization as an internal facilitator. Some people came from the agile world, which is really interesting too. Other people were from a kind of education background. They were using facilitators as an educator. And then also people who do the graphic recordings and graphic facilitation too. And this group was basically just very welcoming and friendly and very curious and open, learning from each other. So I really thought, I want to be part of this. And I heard about this certification that they were doing. And I thought, okay, if I'm going to make facilitation my career, I want to be able to call myself a facilitator. So I want to try to get this certification. And that's when I started to intentionally try to learn more about and get more training on facilitation.
Mm-hmm. And how did you decide your own path? How did you eventually end up with happy teams? How was this path of arriving at this brand, and what makes it unique?
I have to adapt always to where I am, like the context that I'm in. And in where I started facilitating in Laos, I was very, very lucky because it was a fairly small community of international organizations that I was working with. And it was like pretty easy to get jobs. And they were looking for not very specific types of facilitation, but rather general, like meeting management and team retreats. So I could be a generalist. I didn't have to say this is the kind of specific kind of facilitation that I do. But then after that, when I moved to Washington, D.C. with my family, because my husband got another job, it was totally different because the market is much bigger, right? There are a lot more facilitators, consultants, trainers, coaches, people doing similar types of work. And when I would mention that, I'm a facilitator, I want to do group facilitation, they would say, well, what kind of clients and what kind of issues? And I say, because at that point I didn't really have a specialty, right? I say, well, different kinds, and then quickly realized that this is not enough. I needed to have a kind of niche. And for a while I thought, okay, what can I do? Well, I thought because of my background, it's probably to do something about intercultural, helping groups who are from different backgrounds talk to each other, and something about building teams, because that was what I was really passionate about. So that the idea of focusing on teamwork, I started developing in the US. And the happy part, I think, I've always thought that being happy is a condition for success, not the other way around. Happy in the sense of really doing meaningful work, doing things for others. Happy is in fulfilled, and happy as in our relationships.
And maybe also happy as in safe to disagree.
Yeah, and being accepted for who you are, basically. And having the feeling of, okay, I can be myself. I can say what I want, what I think in this group. I don't have to feel like I have to police myself. And then at the same time, it's not only about me, right? It's about, okay, how can we do this together? It's that spark or that sense of we're doing this, something that's about more than just me.
So I learned that coming out of this frustration of being a leader of large volunteering teams and having meetings that drag on together, having people who have good ideas but are not able to being heard because of a tendency for consent. This is what basically drove you to professionalize in the facilitation world. And then when people ask you, okay, what is it actually that we can get from you? You started to make teams really your thing. And if I look at what you do today, I think one of your most important tools in working with teams are the Belbin team roles. Can you explain a bit what are these and what do you appreciate most about them?
So Belbin team roles, it's been around for a long time, since it was developed in the 80s or 90s. What I appreciate most about it is that it's behavior-based, meaning that it's based on observable behaviors of people in specific team contexts. So it's not so much about who you are in terms of your innate personality. It's more about what are the observable clusters of behaviors, they say, of how you contribute and how you are on a team. Because I deal with teamwork, I find that it gives one a kind of language for people to talk about their own strengths and contributions and how they like to work or the preferred work styles in a language that's not judgmental, because there's no right or wrong way or better or worse. It's just your type. And I also like the fact that you're not one type. You're kind of a mixture of, usually you have one or two dominant or strong roles, and you have a few weaker roles where you don't like to do them and you're not that good at that role. And there's this idea that your strength is also your weakness. So what you're good at if you're not careful, the flip side of the coin, it has the danger that it will detract from your strength. So for example, there's one role that's called a shaper, someone who's very driven and can drive the team to get results, and they're the ones who are saying, come on, we need to do this, and that's like driving towards results. It could be a very positive thing, but the flip side of that is they could be unintentionally or intentionally hurting people's feelings or ignoring people who have different ideas. That could be a flip side. So there, if you think about it, every strength is also a potential weakness. And then there's also this idea that we are adaptable. So in a different context, you might have to stretch yourself a little bit to fill the role if there's nobody else doing that role. Like, for example, someone who's checking the details, who's checking the dots and making sure that the document is well prepared and there are no spelling mistakes. If there's nobody on the team who's doing that, it might not be your number one preferred role, but it might be something that you could do. You can stretch and do it.
So I have certain roles, certain preferences, maybe like in other personality type models, but it's all focused on the outside behavior. And let's say if I am usually not having the role that's focused very much on the nitty-gritty details, but now we are in the situation that we want to launch this new product and we really need to make sure that it's getting out right because we want to print 500 pieces of that, then I can stretch to actually do this detailed work, even though it's not my number one preference in a way.
Strength, yeah. You could think of it in terms of strength. And usually when I do this workshop, often I'll start off with an exercise where I'll ask the group to do something together. Let's say like I'll give them instructions and say, okay, you're going to draw a picture of something that represents, I don't know, what you have in common. And then you always find that there's always somebody who's like, okay, let's do this idea, or translating the ideas into action. So you always need some. In any team effort, there's a similar set of, you can call them roles or behaviors, or you can call them strengths, like a combination of strengths that are required for any team endeavor. And it's pretty universal if you think about it. And so that, and usually one person could fill multiple strengths or roles, and you'll find that happening a lot. And it's this idea that we are flexible to a point. You can be flexible to a point, but we are most successful when we are playing to our strengths.
Makes a lot of sense. I really like it. And how does that look like if I now engage into a Belbin journey with you as a coach? How does that look like from a participant team member perspective? Do we start with an assessment and then we meet for a workshop, or can you really take us into the step-by-step process of this?
Yeah, I would ask that each of the members of the team to complete the assessment. Maybe the assessment itself takes about 20 minutes to complete, but you are required to ask a minimum of 4, maximum of 6 external observers to assess you. And you can choose who you want to ask. But usually it should be at least several people from your own team that you work together on a regular basis. So you have what you think of yourself, and then you have what other people think of you. Yeah. At the workshop, as a facilitator, I would share the results. You get to see if there's a difference between how you see your own contributions on the team and what the team members see. And that's a very, very important aspect of that.
Yeah, I can imagine to have like my own self-image being kind of reality checked with how other people see me. And how do I ask these other people? Do I send them a survey invite?
Yeah, it's all done through the Belbin website. And if you check, it's pretty straightforward. There's almost no point to doing it just for yourself. You really need to have the external observers for it to be a complete profile.
And how does it continue in the workshop then?
Well, I would probably first start out like looking at the report. We also talk about your strengths. Are you exhibiting those behaviors in that team? And if so, what aspects would you like to become better at, or you want to emphasize more? So there's a personal aspect, but there's also the relationship with the team aspect. So that's the part one would be reading, thinking, reflecting on your personal strengths and maybe the gap between how you see yourself and how others see you. And then part two would be, let's draw a picture of what in our team, what roles or what strengths do we have when we look at the collective picture. What strengths do we have on the team? Where are the gaps?
And in that part one, you said, like, in a team where we have 10 people, there's usually 2 where there's really this significant gap between self-perception and outside perception. How do you unpack that? Is that a self-reflection? Is that a peer-to-peer coaching process, or do you do that in front of the entire group?
I do combination. So first individual reflection, and then I give a couple of prompt questions for them to discuss in pairs. It's usually something very simple, like, do you notice, is there a gap between what the strengths that you mentioned and the way that others see you? You know, what could be the reasons, possible reasons behind it? Because it takes a little bit of time just to look at the results and understand and wrap your head around it. And actually, when I first took the assessment, I was one of those people. I had a big gap between how I saw myself and how others saw me. And in my case, a lot of my responsibilities as the leader of the nonprofit group was, I thought I was doing a lot of external relationship work, like we call it, like making connections, finding out opportunities externally, bringing those opportunities back. I thought I was doing that. I thought I was doing a lot of coordinator work, like coordinating roles, coordinating jobs. And then how other people saw me, they saw me as quite detail-oriented and quite specialist, having a very deep about one subject, and which was quite kind of surprising for me. And so the other people were not seeing what I was doing. So that's one example.
And how did that change your behavior as a team leader?
It gave me options. For example, I can continue to do what I think is important, but kind of improve my communication. I can say, well, listen, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm good at. And I want to do this more and want to get your understanding. That's one option. Another option is, like, to be honest with myself and say, you know, this is something that I'm doing, but actually I'm not that into it, or I'm not that enthusiastic about it. So maybe I should just ask Susan. She's more suited to it, and she would probably do better at it than I am. So I can shift some of the responsibility to her, and rather I do more of the fact-checking, or, you know, taking care of the details and doing the completer finisher role, which is one of the other roles, for example. And then I could own my detail-orientedness more. And that way I'll be spending more time doing something that I'm stronger at anyway. But it's choice, it's opening up.
The awareness gives you the ability to own also your weaknesses, if we want to name it like that, and proudly delegate the things that other people can do better in a way. And if we go through this Belbin experience as a team, then it also brings transparency, like who actually are these people. Probably there is some level of transparency, but especially when maybe not every team member is super aware or self-aware, then I guess it can also be really powerful to cultivate this common language of having this role and that role. And now I will always, I don't know, ask you for help when it comes to detail orientation, fact-checking.
It's in the language of non-judgment. Yeah, so that's really important, because it's easy to fall into this labeling or attaching negative connotations to certain people and using this Belbin. But actually any other kind of assessment, if you use it properly, it can be very powerful, because it gives people a language to talk with each other in a non-threatening way. But also it does make people think about leadership in a different way, because often leaders are expected to have certain attributes, which sometimes they don't have, like they're strong in other ways. And there are many different ways to be a leader in a team. And it opens up the discussion for that. And I've been in many instances where groups will say, like the most junior person will actually be the shaper role, where they're like the drive or the motivator. And the team leader doesn't have to be that shaper. They could delegate more. They could be stronger in other roles. But so it allows the team to have that discussion about, who do we go to when, for example, we need to put ideas into reality, or who do we go to when we need to set up a system to do things, make things orderly, or who do we go to when we need some out-of-the-box ideas, very, creative ideas. Who's good at that?
I found this phase of our conversation very fascinating because right now we are working on something quite similar at MetaFox. Nami describes the power of helping clients to compare their self-perception with an outside perspective. And at MetaFox, we're building the MetaFox Strengths Explorer, which helps you at exactly that, not only in a team building process, as Nami describes it here, but also in a one-on-one coaching journey. I experienced this myself when I was doing a mindfulness-based strengths practice coach, and the realization of, this is how other people see me versus this is how I see myself, was a very powerful experience. This is exactly the tool that we are building right now at MetaFox, and if you want to try it out, go to metafox.eu/strengths. And back to our conversation. So at this point, let's maybe go back to our facilitator shoes and to this process. We said, okay, there is this pre-survey. As a participant, I ask people for how do they see me. Then in the workshop room, we have these peer-to-peer conversations about our results, self-perception versus perception of others. Mm-hmm. And then in part 2, you said we take a step back from our own results maybe and look at the entire team results and the composition of our team. How exactly do you do that in the session room?
So what I do is I draw a big circle. So there are, in the Belbin method, there are 9 different roles. And as I mentioned before, usually each person will have 2 or 3 strengths. And then I would ask people to write their top 2 strengths, write down their initials or their name on the circle. And then we look at it together, and I would ask them, just, not knowing that this is your team, just looking at the distribution of where the people are, what would you guess about this team? Because sometimes you'll have teams where a lot of people are clustered in just a few roles or strengths. And then you'll see like teams where one role is missing. Nobody's doing that. And often there's a light bulb moment where they'll say, that's why we've been having these challenges with our team, because either we don't have the person doing that role, or there are too many people doing the role, or maybe the team leader, like the way they manage their tasks, it doesn't play to their strengths, for example.
And what can we do then with that as a team?
I use Belbin not as an end-all, or it's not the only tool that you can use to improve teamwork. It does help to be able to appreciate each other's strengths and to really know that you can make contributions in a different way. You don't have to fit the mold of one type of team player. Not everybody has to be a team player. You can make a different kind of contribution.
And maybe to specify my question, also, I'm still in my mind in this workshop room, and we just had this experience. How do you now accompany this transition from having this Belbin workshop experience back to reality? How do you make it stick, or what are the immediate next steps that you ask for?
So depending on what the team uses it for, because some teams want to use it for like a very specific purpose, like how do they want to improve their teamwork, or it could be Like maybe they're having a conflict and they want to resolve it. So it would depend on what they, like where the team wants to go, or do they want to recruit new members, for example? What kind of, not just the technical capabilities, but what kind of team strengths are they looking to fill? For example, that could be one conversation. But in general, so first you look at the personal strengths and the gap between self-perception and other perception. And then the part two would be looking at the team, like what mix of roles do we have? Where are the gaps? How do they fill them? What does this say about how we work together? What are the areas we want to improve? And how do we improve it? We have that discussion. And then probably action steps, like, okay, number one, number two, what can we do? What are the actions we could take?
Mm-hmm. And this is what the team comes up with by themselves?
Yeah, that's what the facilitator is there for, to help them have that discussion. Usually, like what I just described, it's like a day and a half process.
Okay, so the Belbin experience. Thanks a lot. I'm sure there would be many other methods that we could dive into. But before that, I would love to also talk about money. Because I think that is a topic that is generally not talked about enough, and yet it's so crucial also in this journey of becoming a coach or a group facilitator. Let's stay there for a minute and shed light on that. If you sell a Belbin workshop to a team, do you sell the entire Belbin experience and the team is just paying you, or do they also get an invoice from Belbin organization for using the methodology?
Oh, the way that I've done it, and I think different trainers or facilitators can have different ways, but I handle the ordering. So I charge my own fee, and then on top of that, I charge for the Belbin, the individual reports, which are, I forgot exactly, but like 70 euros or something per report. And I just add it to my fee when I write my proposal, if I think that that's what they need. It's pretty straightforward. I just add the cost to my fee.
Mm-hmm. And it's also transparent. The customer sees, okay, Nami says the best thing we can do is this Belbin thing. So now this will add 70 euros per participant to our invoice. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, anybody can go on the website and see how much it costs, and I charge the same. I just kind of order the reports myself because it allows me to look at the results before they can download it. I can print it out and I could take a look before we get into the workshop, so I can know in advance like what issues we might come up.
Yeah.
But I think there are a lot of other assessment methods out there that they use different methodology or different systems. I prefer systems where I can control how I sell at the workshop. So actually, I don't think I've ever sold a workshop as a Belbin workshop.
Okay. So how do you sell your workshops, and to whom?
As a team development or team within a wider topic of team building, usually, or team conflict resolution. Mm-hmm. And I use Belbin as one tool, but it shouldn't be the main focus. For me, anyway, that's why I look at it. It should be a tool to use.
Yeah, definitely. And you are working with international organizations like UNICEF and GIZ, and now having learned a lot about your intercultural experience and also like learning to connect to these very different sorts of people, maybe the hard way, let's say, that makes a lot of sense. But how did that evolve from a business perspective? How did through your first paid journeys and how did you manage to get access to this sort of customer group?
Well, in the beginning, I was lucky, as I said, because I lived in a place with a high concentration of international organizations in one small city. and
that was Laos.
I had the background. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because it's a small town and everybody knows everyone. When I moved to Washington, D.C., I struggled because it's a much bigger city. People with a lot more experience than I have. Or there are lots of consultants, very excellent, very high level people there. But then I thought, okay, what's my niche? Like, what's my background that I could kind of leverage? And for me, it happened to be, and also my personal preference, I seem to connect better with mission-driven, how should I say, like non-government or mission-driven organizations, or groups of people who really believe in the mission of the organization, and also groups of people coming from very different backgrounds, culture or nationality, because I can relate to them and they can relate to me. That's been a constant for me, like the common denominator.
Mm-hmm. How does the sales process look like, and how do you charge them differently? What's your pricing and your package for these different sorts of clients?
So when I was first in the earlier years, when I was starting out, I didn't know how to charge. Yeah, even now I'm not really sure if I know how to charge, but I know how long things take me. So, for example, if I'm organizing or facilitating and designing a retreat, let's say a 2-day retreat, I know that it takes me, like at the time, like minimum twice as long as the retreat itself for the training, for example, or realistically 2.5 times the number of days, right? So, and then after that, if they want me to write a report, it takes me another, half a day or 1 day, or depending on like the kind of report that they want. So I know roughly how long it takes me, and then I ask around, like, what's the rate, and different organizations will have different criteria for how much the day rate is. I try to ask around and kind of, you never really know. Sometimes they say a price and then you don't hear back from them, or sometimes they say they get back to me very quickly and say sure, and then I think, oh, maybe I could have charged them a little bit more. So it's sometimes, especially when I'm in a new place, I have to ask around, and because there's a range and then there's a market.
And where would you ask around? Do you actually ask the client if you have a trusting relationship there, or is it rather other facilitators that you ask?
I would probably ask if they have a budget. How many days are you looking at? How much time do we have? Do you have a budget? And then I would ask my colleagues, my facilitator friends, how much are you charging? And usually people will tell me if I know them well enough.
So does your client get an invoice for, okay, there's a daily rate of X dollar times 5 days?
Yeah.
No, your client gets one price for the entire experience.
I like to give it as a package for a process or for a series of workshops. And in my package, I do always include a follow-up. But sometimes if I'm applying for a request for proposals, then often they will have a specification, like they expect you to write the number of working hours or days that you will spend on this project, and in that case I will give an estimate of how long it will take.
Okay, yeah, I see. And let's talk some numbers. Like, what would be let's say this 1.5 day team building experience? How much would that be?
It depends on how easy or difficult it is. It also depends on what the group is like. Is it a small group? Is it like 50 people? Will I need to hire an assistant? Will I need to prepare a lot for this? Doing surveys, doing pre-interviews. And then another consideration is market, like where am I based? So based in Indonesia, the rate is very different from if I'm based in Washington, D.C. So I can't charge the same fee that I was charging in Washington, D.C. I have to be realistic because they're, the market is different. Probably, so like if the daily rate is like anywhere from like $800 to $1,500, let's say $1,500 US dollars in the US. So maybe let's say $1,000, you want to charge for a day. In Indonesia, it would be like a third of that.
So you actually do make this differentiation even when working with GIZ, where you could say, well, this is a German customer, I can charge a German level rate. You still say, okay, it's a German customer, but we are in Indonesia, so I charge an Indonesian rate?
I wish I could charge a US or German rate. I don't know. I kind of play it by ear because I'm based in Indonesia. And actually, it's an advantage that I don't have to travel, right? Or I'm closer to my clients. And I think that that's the value that I can provide, that I can do things for slightly cheaper. And there are other facilitators out there who are, pretty good, but we do different types of facilitation.
And so the answer is, it really makes a difference.
Yeah.
There is this geographical component that is quite strong, actually. No matter where the customer's coming from, actually.
Yeah, I think we get pulled by that.
And
So I would say,
let's say we as a company, we have a new leadership team, and we would say now we take our leadership team to Bali and go through this experience of growing as a team together, maybe bringing up some elephants that are in the room and resolving them, getting to know our strengths. That is basically the sort of journey we would go through together with you.
Yeah. And sometimes they'll have different teams will have different emphasis on what they want to talk about. So for example, a common one is we want to be able to collaborate better or more across different divisions or silos, That's a really common one that I get. The other one is we want to be able to, I hear this often, like everybody's doing their own thing, own project or work, and there's no sense of them like working as a team or as a group. And we want to explore, we want to get to know what other people are doing and maybe explore opportunities for more, I guess that's collaboration. Yeah, collaboration.
And to whom have you sold this sort of journey?
Different UN or international organizations. I'm still exploring what I can do here based in Jakarta and around, so maybe going to Bali or Singapore, or I'm exploring.
And what's your next milestone on that journey?
So I think the retreats, it's something that's easy for people to understand or to, it's fairly compact and you get results pretty quickly. It's like short and sweet and quite powerful actually. So I want to sell more of those retreats. So I'm looking at the retreats as it doesn't require a very serious time commitment for the client.
How much?
Well, the shortest retreats I've done is just a day. And I tell them it can be in Jakarta or it can be in, if not your office, it could be, you can rent a nice room somewhere. You don't have to go and spend a whole day traveling. But it's nice to be in a different environment, like maybe get out of the city a little bit. I will say everyone has their own journey or everyone has their own particular background, and what will be your strength will be different for each person. And there was a time when I thought, like, I was thinking I want to become like 100% process, only doing specific type of facilitation, but actually it's not very feasible. And actually, even the most successful facilitators I've noticed or I've heard don't necessarily do facilitation all the time. So I'm thinking a lot about that, being flexible, and how do I take the skills and experience that I have and kind of market it in a way that will be attractive, and using a kind of language that people will understand about what value that I provide. And I think this is the same for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, taking your own unique story and turning it into the coach, the facilitator that you are.
Yeah, in that way, nobody will be able to imitate because only you can do that.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this was super interesting. I feel like there could have been many more rabbit holes to dive in, like NVC, Pecha Kucha, actually your experience with IFF. These are all things that maybe eventually we can have a chat about, but I think for today we have enough. And I also prefer to go deep into one thing rather than touching on many things superficially. Cool.
Yeah, thank you. I think through this process of talking, it's helped me to kind of clarify what I'm thinking, because I'm not always thinking why I'm doing what I'm doing now. So I want to thank you as well.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
This was the making of Nami Ishihara on the Making of a Coach podcast. If you want to learn more about Nami and her team building retreats, visit her website on happyteams1.com. And if you learn more about the Belbin team roles, go to belbin.com. If you want to create similar strengths-based coaching journeys with the MetaFox Strengths Explorer, go to metafox.eu/strengths. And the only thing that's left for me to say is thanks, Nami, for this heart-to-heart conversation. Thanks to Justin from the MetaFox team for turning our 2.5 hour long talk into this episode. And if you like it, send it to another coach or follow the Making of a Coach. I'm excited to join the next journey on the Making of a Coach next time on your favorite podcast app. See you then.